This episode is a continuation of the conversation in episode 5. Be sure to listen to that episode first and then come back.
Yes, I think you're putting your finger right on something essential here. But the work isn't to vanish into the woods or burn it all down and walk away, which is its own kind of escapism, but to remain inside these systems, these roles, these privileges, and fundamentally rewire how we inhabit them. And that's not a contradiction. It's actually the most subversive thing we can do. Because you're right, everything external starts as something internal. But here's where I challenge us to go even deeper. It's not just about noticing the constructs we carry: superiority, scarcity, individualism, competition, but also about seeing how they want to express themselves through us, often unconsciously. The system isn't out there waiting to be escaped. It's running on internalized scripts we've inherited and rehearsed for so long they feel like truth itself. So the work becomes recognizing, questioning, and rewriting those scripts, not once, but continuously, because they're sticky and persistent. And your point about people with economic or social power is so interesting, because there's a cultural script that says, if you wake up to the emptiness of status and consumption, the ethical thing to do is to renounce it all, to divest and disappear. But what if the more radical move is to stay in those rooms, on those stages, in those roles, but show up from a place of compassion, reciprocity, and presence, rather than fear and domination? What if subversion isn't exit, but transformation from within? And you're right, what that looks like will always be utterly unique to the person, because the condition they're unwinding is also unique. I also love your observation that the immediate impulse is often toward binary thinking. Either keep playing the game as it is, or leave the game entirely. But there's this middle path that isn't really middle at all. It's an entirely different dimension. And it starts, as you said, by questioning why we're so attached to purely external measures of impact. We can't see interior shifts, so we discount them. But those interior shifts are what change external behavior over time, often in ways we could never have planned or predicted. Where I'd add something is that grief, which you mentioned, plays a central role. Because part of why it's so hard to let go of those old attachments is that doing so feels like dying. Not just metaphorically, but truly, the death of a self that was built on scarcity, fear, and social comparison. And so the work isn't just cognitive, it's emotional, somatic, spiritual. You have to feel the grief of letting go of an identity that was in some ways protective, even if it was also suffocating. And the more power and privilege someone has, the more grief there usually is, because they've been rewarded by the system they now have to question. What excites me most about what you're naming is the idea that the real transformation isn't about heroic, headline-grabbing acts of resistance. It's about thousands or millions of tiny subversive choices that add up. Each of us, wherever we are, asking, how do I show up differently today? And not perfectly, but consistently, with more presence, more compassion, more willingness to see others and myself as ends in themselves, rather than as means to an end. And I want to turn this back to you, because I think it's an important nuance. If the goal isn't escape, but subversion from within, what helps you discern the difference between an act that just props up the system under a new label versus an act that actually loosens its hold? What does that feel like internally? How do you know when you're genuinely moving from a place of love and presence, rather than just rearranging the furniture of fear?
I love where this question takes us to close out the conversation today, because that's what it's all about, right? Practically speaking, going forward, how can I today start enacting this in my own life? And for me, I really see these opportunities every day, and I see them in all kinds of interactions. And again, I think this is something we've spoken about or touched on before, but it's worth coming at it from a lot of different angles, because we're not conditioned to think about our interior lives this way, and we're also not conditioned to reflect on how we react or respond in these well-worn scripts that we don't even realize we're following. So for instance, one thing I've become very aware of is the in arguments or disagreements or debates, the automatic kind of antagonistic stance between two people, and finding that, if I upset someone and they lash out or they get agitated, I can recognize that the script is to also get defensive, to also get agitated. The next level above that is to make them look even more immature than me, to remain calm and level-headed while they look out of control to everybody else, right? But all of these different reaction scripts play into the same fundamental mode of antagonism, of me versus this person. Someone is going to win this interaction. It's a competition, right? So that's what I try to notice, is when one of those social competitions arises, I try to respond and repair in a way that actually makes the other person look more intelligent or compliments them, or reinforces their sense of importance. And it's very destabilizing, right? It's very destabilizing to these dynamics, and you have to kind of show up this way repeatedly. And sometimes it requires, after the fact, right, going back and trying to repair the relationship or the interaction retroactively. But when you fundamentally refuse to engage with the competitive default stance and show up differently, I have noticed it changes relationships over time. And I've seen, behaviors from people that I would never expect, really positive shifts in behavior that are much more vulnerable, much more loving, much more selfless, right? That I never would have expected to see from that person, for instance. And so I think that's one example of what this looks like, is, stepping beyond, taking the high road, being the bigger person, right? But really saying, what is the fundamental dynamic here? The fundamental dynamic that is, of the old paradigm, is this idea that we are in competition with each other, me and this person, because we disagree about something, right? That disagreeing about something does not necessitate competition. It does not necessitate a winner and a loser. And so there's probably countless other examples. I would love to hear from you, Kairon, actually, if you think about this example of competition. What other ones can you come up with, right? So when I talk about, disagreement does not inherently need to create competition, are there other recurrent social dynamics that you can think of that we connect that way that do not need to be connected? I would love to hear some more examples that come to mind for you, and then maybe I can give some examples of what working with that in real time as a human every day looks like.
Yes, I love how you just named that so precisely, that there's a level above simply stay calm, which can itself become a kind of ego armor. Like, look at me, I'm so unflappable, and instead moving towards something relational, reparative, and generative, rather than just defensive. That's a huge difference, not just resisting escalation, but actually dissolving the very frame that says escalation must happen. So to your question, what are other habitual social pairings or default scripts that feel inevitable to us but don't have to be? One huge one is disagreement leads to disconnection. It's almost an article of faith that if two people hold opposing views on something deeply personal, it must create emotional distance. And yet, disagreement could just as easily become an invitation to deeper curiosity or an exploration of complexity together, if we let go of the need to win or protect an identity. Another default script is failure leads to shame. We assume that when we make mistakes, especially publicly, shame is the inevitable response. But failure could also lead to vulnerability, reflection, and even a more authentic bond with others who see us owning our imperfections. The shame isn't built into the failure itself, It's culturally attached, and it's optional once we see that. Here's another. Hierarchy leads to deference. When someone is perceived as higher status, boss, expert, elder, the reflex is often to shrink, to censor, to defer completely. But hierarchy could also become a chance to bring in authentic perspective, to challenge gently, to ask questions that a higher status person rarely hears because everyone else is busy performing deference. This script doesn't require silencing yourself. That's a social habit, not a law of nature. And one more I'd add is vulnerability to weakness. The reflex is to conceal softness, sadness, or fear, because they undermine strength. But vulnerability could instead invite connection, trust, and real respect, because it models courage. What I love about your framing is that none of these are about just being nicer or more polite. They're about seeing the invisible assumptions we carry, competition, shame, deference, and saying, these are habits, not truths. Once we see them, we can choose. And choosing differently, over time, changes the relational field we're part of. So I'd love to hear from you. How do these other scripts show up in day-to-day life? And what does it look like in the moment to interrupt them? Not in some grand way, but in small, subversive, very human choices.
I love these examples. And before I get into your question, I want to add on to what you said about disagreement and disconnection, something I bring up a lot in conversations with friends and family who find themselves at very strong political differences with people, especially the state of our country today, is that I think people who feel very strongly about problems that face our country and our citizenry and solutions that need to be implemented to solve those problems, I think no matter what, two different people think those problems are or think the solutions are, I think the passion, having that shared passion about them and having the shared, energy, like you're both, my point is you have more in common than you lack because you both care so deeply. Right? The fact that you care at all and aren't content to just live in ignorant bliss and indifferently move through your life means that you two have this incredible central trait and value in common. And there's so much to build off of there, right? Meanwhile, instead, we often end up in our echo chambers surrounded mostly by the indifferent people who just, go with the flow of whatever their social group says, but don't necessarily hold any, strong views or cares one way or the other. So that's just an example of how, disagreement does not need to lead to disconnection. In fact, and this goes into answering your question, in any situation of disagreement, there's an opportunity to point out, wow, I love how much you care about this. Right? Let me just take a moment to appreciate that you care about this issue enough to be in disagreement with me about it and to try to work toward some kind of solution or even just some kind of mutual respect or any kind of understanding, right? I just appreciate that you care enough about, our relationship, for instance, to put that time in, whatever it is. I think anytime you're in that place of disagreement and finding yourself wanting to move to disconnection is a great time to turn your attention to all of the traits and values that you and that other person actually share and to get much more imaginative and much more big picture in how you look to identify those things, because they don't need to be these little tiny weedy details. They can be these much bigger picture, much more foundational values, and those are much more powerful anyway. The other piece around failure and shame, I think that's really hard, right? Because shame is one of those things that we feel is largely projected onto us by others. We fail at something and we feel a sense of embarrassment, right? That comes entirely from our projecting into the minds of others this judgment of us that could very well be there, right? And when we don't react to failure with shame, or with visible shame, right? people might just as well think that we are still ashamed of our failure. We're just, hiding it really well. So this one really becomes a question for ourselves. And for me, when I find myself in that moment, I look back at all the times in my life that I have failed. And there are countless. And when I actually look at those times and I trace the patterns and I look at the recurrent failures and similarities with them, I realize that these are the moments in my life that have been the most pivotal, where I have learned the most, where I have grown the most. And then I get sincerely excited about what kind of growth and learning and new opportunities are going to arise because of this failure. So to me, that's a very personal, internal process that requires a detachment from the perceived opinions of others, and actually asking, what does this failure actually mean for me in terms of my journey and my learning and my growth? Hierarchy and deference is something I actually talk about a lot in the context of neurodivergent experiences in the workplace. And I am a career coach for neurodivergent professionals, and this is considered a big quote unquote problem with neurodivergent professionals, which is that we don't show deference to hierarchy. And I would love to see that expectation, challenged in workplaces. Why does there have to be that deference? I myself have certainly shown up in a lot of those situations with someone very, very senior, with CEO, that kind of person, and spoken plainly and calmly and, not nervous and scared, but just on very challenging topics, and been surprised by some of the positive outcomes that have been able to arise. So this is a great one for when we think about how we show up in, say, a job that you hate, right? Say you're one of many people who are having this kind of anxiety these days. You might have a 6-figure salary. You have so many bills and a mortgage to pay. You can't just up and quit your job, but your job is sucking the life out of you. How can you start subverting this expectation of deference in the face of hierarchy? What would happen if you just tactfully said the thing that needed to be said in front of the right people in the right room? Like, start pushing those boundaries, right? Instead of trying so hard to get a good performance review, maybe it's like, all right, I'm just trying to not get fired, right? And see what happens. It's pretty incredible when you shift those expectations and you don't have an attachment that comes out of fear to how you might actually be able to show up differently and improve things for people around you. Again, I'm speaking in very general terms because it's so different in different settings and with different people how this shows up. But that's a great example of one to challenge, is what does it look like to engage with hierarchy without deference while still being respectful and being intelligent and level-headed, right? I think is that's a great one to start with. And lastly, vulnerability and weakness. Again, this is another one that really shows up a lot in the workplace. I have found that vulnerability, someone's capacity to show vulnerability, is actually paradoxically one of the greatest ways to display strength, right? It's kind of like, birds and a lot of sea creatures. I think there's a lot of different animals where the more flamboyantly colored the male is, the more attractive he is to the female, because it shows that he has strong survival instincts and he has good genes, because he's very visible to predators and he's still alive despite being so visible and so flamboyantly colored. To me, it's that same kind of thing. Is like, if you can show your soft underbelly, that means that you feel, above harm, right? That you can't be harmed by anything that would come with that display. And so to me, showing vulnerability is actually a tremendous signal of strength. And the people with the least strength tend to not be vulnerable at all and be extremely closed off and afraid, right? I think the least fearful people are the ones who will be the most vulnerable. And so vulnerability and weakness, to me, is a pretty easy one to challenge. And especially being in like a leadership position, you can gain a lot of followers, at work by as showing that vulnerability by talking about your mistakes with confidence. This is something that I do in my workshop work a lot, especially when we talk about anti-racism and anything in that kind of world. I think talking about your mistakes and what happened inside of you as you made those mistakes and how you did or failed to compensate for those mistakes, all of that demonstrates tremendous strength to me at the same time as it demonstrates vulnerability. It's just like being that one person in the meeting who asked the question, like the person speaking is using an acronym over and over and you don't know it. And you're confident that in your role, if that acronym was something you should know, you would know it. And so you ask the question, what does that stand for? Everyone else in the room who's afraid to ask the question now sees you as strong and confident because you were willing to ask. But technically that was showing vulnerability, right? That was saying something you don't know. So I love these examples, and I hope that these are some helpful ways to put those, challenging those things into action. That was pretty long. I think we've gone over time for today. So Kairon, any final reactions to that or final thoughts you want to share?
I love that you took each of those and grounded them so directly in lived day-to-day practice, rather than keeping them abstract. And yes, I think what you just named is crucial, that we're not just talking about ideas, but about real embodied choices that show up in meetings, family dinners, arguments, moments of self-doubt. These ordinary moments where the entire paradigm is either reinforced or subverted. If I had to offer a closing reflection, it's this: the deepest through line connecting everything you described, from refusing to turn disagreement into disconnection, to meeting failure with curiosity instead of shame, to engaging hierarchy without deference, to choosing vulnerability as strength, is that each is a refusal to outsource your sense of worth or truth to external scripts. It's a shift from reactivity to response, and it requires the continual work of inner witnessing. And what's beautiful and paradoxical is that this isn't really about self-improvement in the individualistic sense. It's not about perfecting yourself into some flawless, ultra-confident person. It's about seeing the web you're part of and noticing where you unconsciously hold the strands tighter than they need to be. By loosening those strands, by refusing the automatic scripts, you actually free the entire web to move differently. That, to me, is why these small daily choices matter so much more than any big heroic gesture. Because the big systems we critique, hierarchy, competition, shame, disconnection, aren't sustained by big heroic villains. They're sustained by billions of tiny, everyday moments where each of us unconsciously plays along. So maybe the most subversive thing any of us can do isn't to escape or transcend, but to stay fully present, see clearly, and choose differently, right where we already stand. And then, over time, to watch what new relational, cultural, and systemic patterns emerge from that ground-up refusal to keep the old scripts alive. That's where I'd leave it today, and I'm excited to keep exploring how this shows up, messily and imperfectly, in everyday life in future conversations.
I love that as a very simple and powerful idea to close out on, that we don't need to make these massive, sweeping changes, take these huge, heroic actions or leaps of faith to see the change we want to see in the world. One person doing a big action like that is worth far less than thousands or millions of people taking these small everyday actions, just tipping the scales in that other direction and subverting in all these small ways all of the countless scripts and systems that uphold the old paradigm that we are so sick of. Every single one of us has the power to do that in small ways, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whoever we're interacting with. And to me, that's very liberating and that's very exciting. So that's it for today. We will see you next time on Divergent Future.